So the other research that is on there, the article, if you work in hospice, I know some of you guys do work in hospice or palliative care, or are going to be a nurse, because this is what we do, is we take care of people that are dying, no matter what unit you work on. I would highly recommend reading this article, and this is a 2014 or 15 just summary of where we have come in the research on death and dying, grief, the grief process. And Dr. Niemeyer really slams the Kubler-Ross model of the grieving process. The whole, which you do have to know for test taking. Remember the stages, Kubler-Ross's stages? Denial. I have a slide on it. We'll talk about it. But he really slams that. He said that's not what grief looks like at all. What grief looks like is this cyclical thing. It's a cyclical thing that can potentially stay with you for years and years and years. It will stay with you for years and years, and that's not abnormal. The DSM-3, I think, and the DSM-4 had this whole section about dysfunctional grief, which they call a mental disorder. And what they did is they just put a time frame on it. Your baby died, and you're still sad 6 months later. Now you have dysfunctional grief. That's what they call it, dysfunctional grief. And so, yeah, the whole idea of it is a little bit ridiculous, but that's also kind of what they're finding with Kubler-Ross. And you'll have people talk about this and ask you questions about this, and they'll say things like, I've been trying to do my grief work, and I still haven't reached this stage. Over the last 20 years, the research has failed to identify any single person that went through these 5 stages and went through them in order. It's just not the way people grieve. This was based on Freud's idea of decathexis. Freud, in the year 1900, published one of his first books, and he said that healthy mourning requires grief work. Now what grief work really is this relinquishment or letting go of our bondage to the deceased. That process of letting go. And empirical research has shown that the exact opposite is true in every society worldwide. The exact opposite is true. We don't let go and we don't move on. We do the opposite. We celebrate that person's death. That's why we have Memorial Day. We go back to that gravesite. And so it's not in human nature to just move on. And this does create confusion and, I think, heartache for parents, for example, who leave their child's room set up exactly the way it was. And maybe for 20 years, that room hasn't been touched. And so society, because of Freud, and because of Kubler-Ross, society's like, well, that ain't normal. That ain't right. When actually, that's what we do as humans.
In Mexico, like they have like little shrines, like their graveyards, or like little huts, and they have
and they have the Day of the Dead.
And people go there like a lot, like every week, or some even widows.
They honor that person's life.
Food, and it's really, yeah, they keep them like alive in spirit. Like,
Yeah, I think that's really cool.
yeah.
So Niemeyer just pretty much slams that whole thing. the establishment of ongoing bond with the deceased is both healthier and more normal across cultures. He talks about several different models of grief, and most of them are a dual process model. Remember that word dialectical that we talked about the first week? Dialectics is the ability to hold two opposing viewpoints, and that's a lot what the bereavement process seems to look like. Is on the one hand, you oscillate between confronting the loss, but then on the other hand, sometimes you do have to compartmentalize it and not think about it so that you can get back to work. Someone who cannot get out of bed to get to work possibly has dysfunctional grieving, maybe. But in real life, it seems to be this constant cycle, this oscillation between being able to deal with it and not being able to deal with it. And you'll hear people say that all the time. 20, 30 years later, I thought I was over this. I thought I was over this. And then suddenly it all comes crashing back down like a ton of bricks. That's normal. That's perfectly normal. And we don't have to make any sort of pathology out of it like we used to in the DSM. The big thing that the research is showing, and I think this is fascinating because this is actually how the human brain works. The human brain is a storytelling machine. It's a truth-seeking machine. It's trying to make sense of reality, and the way that we do that is we tell stories. We tell stories. And that's why Netflix is a great stock to invest in because they're all about storytelling. That's why people watch Netflix. But it's not the story that we're watching on the big screen at the movie theater that's really the interesting thing. It's the fact that we are telling a story about our own life. And sometimes the movies that we watch help make sense of our own personal narrative, what we call the self-narrative. The self-narrative. It's the way we organize life events, we organize our memories, we think about the future. It all fits into this storyline. And so if your storyline is that you are going to have a Disney movie romance, get married, live happily ever after, and then your spouse gets brain cancer and dies at a very young age. My mom's first husband died 6 months after they were married. She was the valedictorian, he was the salutatorian of their graduating class, high school sweethearts. They got married. He was a marathon runner. She found him dead halfway around the cornfield. Brain aneurysm. Suddenly, her self-narrative has completely changed. And so then the question is, what do we do then? This article does talk about different levels of grief, and I talked about this last week, how somebody can lose a child and another family can lose a child and have totally different grieving processes, and we absolutely know that to be true. Different causes of death cause different amounts of grief. And traumatic injury type deaths or homicide or suicide. Homicide and suicide, and that makes sense to me. The family tends to suffer more. They have more grief. Because it doesn't make sense. What kind of sense does that make when your teenage daughter is shot to death by a stranger? How does that fit your self-narrative? And that's not the way things are supposed to be. If your grandpa, who is 110 years old and has Alzheimer's and hasn't known your name for 20 years, dies, is your grief going to be different than your teenage daughter who died. Of course it is. And that's what the research is showing. Another thing that really popped up in the research in the 80s is this idea of disenfranchised grief. And we've discovered that grief is definitely a social thing. And if the person who died in a way that is not socially sanctioned, then the survivors can suffer from what's called disenfranchised grief, where their grief is not recognized as being valid. And this came out during the AIDS epidemic when we first recognized this phenomenon. If your gay lover dies of AIDS, at that time, that was not okay. It was not okay, because what if you want to have the funeral in your home church who does not approve of homosexuality? And maybe the pastor even says something from the pulpit during the funeral, which happens all the time, still happens to this day. That's an example of disenfranchised grief. And we see patients on the unit a lot where their mistress commits suicide, but nobody even knew they were in love and having an affair because he was married. Is he allowed to show his grief? No, because nobody even knew. And I've probably seen this dozens of times on Adult and Affected, where somebody died that that man or woman was not supposed to be in love with. Disenfranchised grief. But we definitely recognize it in our suicide. In how society treats the survivors of suicide. The parents whose high school kid killed himself. The Catholic Church still preaches that if you commit suicide, you're going straight to hell. Has anyone been to a funeral of a suicide patient or person in a Catholic church? How did that go down? Was that a somber experience? And an experience that fuels helplessness and hopelessness in the survivors, and the family is not allowed to talk to anyone about it, and it's just brushed under the rug. That's disenfranchised grief, where society is not okay with the grief you are experiencing.